Good morning, everyone. My name is William Bailey. I'm the director of the Law Center's 150th anniversary celebrations. I want to welcome you all today and thank you for joining us for this program on our history, the past 50 years, featuring faculty members who've been around for most or all of that time. At this time, it's my great pleasure to introduce, to give you additional welcome remarks, Dean William M. Traynor. As you likely know, Dean Traynor has been leading the Law Center for the past 11 years. He is also the Paul Regis Dean Leadership Chair, and we're very grateful that he's here today to help introduce our moderator. Dean Traynor, welcome.
No, thanks very much, William, for that introduction, for helping put this together. So this is one of the highlights of our series, Georgetown Law at 150, Alumni and Faculty in Conversation. So this is our 150th anniversary, and we've had a series of really terrific programs and more to come. Today's event is a look at the past 50 years of Georgetown Law's history and progress with, as you heard from William, firsthand accounts from faculty members who were there for much of this time to witness it and to help shape it. And I'd like to particularly thank Wally Maliniak for, Wally was the one who came up for the concept for this program. So we have some terrific panelists. We're going to be hearing from Jim Oldham and Jim Feinerman, Pat King, Ginger Patterson, Wally, and Dan Ernst. And they're going to be sharing their thoughts, memories, and their wisdom with us today. So it's going to be a terrific program, and I thank you very much for calling in. The conversation is going to be led by Dan Ernst, Professor Dan Ernst. Dan is the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Legal History. He's also really a superb legal historian and is the author of the book, The First 125 Years, An Illustrated History of the Georgetown University Law Center. It's the most exhaustive and it's the authoritative account of our beginnings. And I have to say, as a fellow legal historian, I've always greatly admired Dan's work, and I look forward to this conversation. So thanks very much for moderating. Let me turn matters over to Dan.
Thank you, Bill, for that introduction and for your leadership. I also want to thank Georgetown Law's archivist, Carol Prieto, for her invaluable help with this session. For the next hour or so, we are going to look back at the last third of the history of Georgetown Law, from 1970 to 2020. In 1970, the Georgetown University Law Center was still located over by Judiciary Square at 506 East Street Northwest, in a building, this portion of it, which opened in 1891 and was later augmented by a series of row houses whose walls were knocked out to form what my late colleague Frank Flagel once called an interconnected rabbit warren of buildings. In 1971, near the start of our story today, the Law Center moved a few blocks to the east and north to its present location on New Jersey Avenue. In time, the first building there, Mcdonald Hall, was joined by 5 other buildings and 2 greens to form a true law campus. In 1970, the full-time faculty numbered 35. Today, it numbers 195. The size of the entering class hasn't changed much, down from 630 in 1970 to 606 today. But tuition has changed in the other direction quite a bit, even after adjusting for inflation. In 1970, tuition for full-time students was just under $2,000 a year. Today, it's just under $67,000. Foreign students are a much greater presence on campus, largely through a very dramatic growth of Georgetown's LLM program. Women made up, in 1970, 12.5% of the entering JD class. This year, they account for 57% of the entering class. We do not seem to have an estimate of the number of minorities who were in the entering class in 1970, but this year, 15% of the entering class is Black and 32% are students of color. Each of these figures, 57%, 15%, and 32%, is the highest in our history. Well, I'm very pleased today that 5 of my most thoughtful colleagues are willing to share with us their recollections of parts of this period and to help us understand how Georgetown law changed in the last half century. James C. Oldham, the St. Thomas More Professor of Law and Legal History, has been a member of the faculty for the entire period we'll be discussing today. Wallace J. Malenik, Wally Malenik, the Lupo Ricci Professor of Clinical Legal Studies, goes back even further if you count his student years, as he was a 1970 graduate of the Law Center. Elizabeth Hayes Patterson, Professor of Law Emerita, also viewed Georgetown law from outside the faculty before joining it in 1980. Professor of Law Emerita Patricia A. King was also a Georgetown law student for 1 year in the 1960s before getting her law degree from another very fine law school and then permanently joining Georgetown law faculty in 1974. James V. Feinerman, the James and Catherine Denny Chair in Democratic Capitalism and the James N. Morita Chair, Professor of Asian Legal Studies, joined the faculty in 1986 after a visit here the preceding week. Well, to get us going, I'm going to turn things over to Jim Oldham.
It's even now a little shocking when people ask me how long I've been on the Georgetown law faculty, and I answer, well, in truth, a half a century. But it has been quite a ride, and I'll talk about it for a few minutes with you. First, let me just do a bit of biographical background. Many of you will be familiar with a country and western singer, Merle Haggard's hit song, Anoki from Muskogee. Well, I am one Anoki from Muskogee, as is my identical twin brother. Our parents grew up in Oklahoma, and we were taken to Muskogee in our mother's womb to be born in our grandfather's hospital. At the time, however, we lived in New Mexico, and we were in New Mexico and Texas for all of my growing up years. I went to both coasts for higher education, to college at Duke, where I studied somewhat unexpectedly engineering, and then went to law school at Stanford. When my then wife and I, when law school was over, we had to decide whether to stay in San Francisco, but we thought it was a little too busy for our tempo of the time, so we elected to settle in Denver, Colorado, which we did, and I practiced law there for 5 years with the firm of Sherman and Howard. And while there, I was assigned to a very demanding labor law partner, and that's how I gained my labor law expertise. After 5 years of practice, I decided that I just did not want to become a partner, but I was uncertain about what to do next. I got in touch with the Stanford Law School dean, Bayless Manning, whom I had come to know while I was there, to seek his advice. He said they were looking, as it happened, for a replacement for an assistant dean, and perhaps I would be interested. Well, this naturally turned my head, as I was only 29 years old, but it would not have been a tenure track job. And eventually I decided that the tenure track was a better choice. I telephoned Dean Manning and told him of my decision, and he paused and then said, "Well, Jim, I do understand your position, but I have one piece of advice." "What is that?" I asked. He said, "Don't go to Georgetown." After a bit of pause, I said, "Well, why?" He said, "Georgetown was in a real mess." And as I later discovered, he was correct. But my interview sessions had introduced me to a small band of warriors, or young Turks, I called them, on the untenured faculty who had great ambitions for the school. And I took a chance and came to Georgetown and have never been sorry. Now, let's move to, you already have seen the picture of the old E Street building. Many stories could be told about that building, but we just won't have time to do them, I fear. So I'll go straight to Mcdonald Hall, which opened in 1971. Mcdonald Hall was designed for us by Edward Durrell Stone, the same architect who designed the Kennedy Center. But as Wally Malinek will affirm, the students were unhappy almost immediately, feeling like sardines packed into a small container. The new building was dedicated by a formal procession and by an address by the Chief Justice, Warren Burger. The students were not happy with this choice of the dedication speaker, and they concocted a counter dedication outside the building where William Kunstler spoke to a large student crowd while standing in the bed of a pickup truck. I don't think any other law school has a comparable experience. So a comparison of the administrative staff at Georgetown in the early 1970s, oh my goodness, there's a picture of me in my youth. A comparison of the staff with in 1970 or 71 with what we know today is just startling. When I was there in 1970, the dean was Adrian Fisher. There he's a picture of him. He was our first outside dean, and he was a wonderful and interesting man who had been very much involved in international law in his career. We had an associate dean, one associate dean, Roy Shotland, and two assistant deans. One was Tom Fisher, who took care of admissions, and I was the other one who took care of everything else. So that was it. That was our decanal staff at the time. Today, I don't know that I could even count the number of assistant deans and associate deans we have, not to mention managers of institutes and other programs. But that's, of course, a transformation that we are all going to speak to. And I don't think it can be anything but just a splendid journey. Then, prior to my first sabbatical, the courses I was teaching were labor law and contracts. I was lucky to be able to teach labor law since when I interviewed at Georgetown, that course had been taught by a Jesuit member of the faculty, Dexter Hanley. But by the time I arrived in Georgetown, Professor Hanley had departed to become president of Scranton University. While teaching contracts, I became familiar with certain decisions in the English common law that influenced American common law. And when the time arrived for my first sabbatical, I decided that it would be rewarding to spend a year in London, and I fashioned a research project around the career of one of England's most famous 18th century judges, the first Earl of Mansfield. Prior to leaving for London, I did a source search to see what had been published about Lord Mansfield and discovered, to my amazement, that manuscript notes that had been taken by Lord Mansfield in jury trials he conducted had survived. So this became my destiny. How I got access to them is another story I don't have time to tell, but eventually I was able to obtain a microfilm copy of these trial notes, which allowed me to work with them in Washington. About a dozen years later, my major scholarly work called The Mansfield Manuscripts and the Growth of English Law in the 18th Century was published. And finally, I felt qualified to call myself a legal historian. This was recognized by Dean Judy Reed when, to my lasting gratitude, she arranged for my endowed professorship. During and ever since that time, I've been teaching the English Legal History seminar. Finally, a quick word about some parallel activity that I did as time permitted. After teaching labor law, I became a labor arbitrator and have conducted arbitration hearings, and I've been teaching a labor arbitration seminar for a number of years, and no time to go into details, but I will mention that it's been an interesting experience that in recent years, I have been an arbitrator in 3 professional sports: baseball, hockey, and football. And a postscript to that is I was fired by both baseball and hockey. I cling to football. With that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks very much. Wally.
So when I arrived at Georgetown in 1967, of course, it was a period of intense social turmoil. 2 presidents in the Congress had lost the trust of the American people. My student years were defined by conflict over the war in Vietnam that seemed to never end, over a long overdue civil rights movement for fair housing, voting rights, and basic justice. Great picture, and basic justice in both the North and the South, over the emerging women's rights movement that challenged male domination in law schools, as well as universities and other aspects of society, and over vicious police attacks on demonstrators seeking redress for these movements in places like Birmingham, Marion, and Selma, Alabama, Mississippi, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Detroit. Students on campuses across the country brought their voices and actually their bodies to these movements. Governments were rigid in their responses to the movements, and the police who carried out their responses were increasingly brutal as the demonstrations swept across campuses in every part of the country. We had witnessed the murders of civil rights leaders and heroes, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, but we also witnessed the murder of students at Kent State and Jackson State by police and National Guard troops. The police in Washington, D.C. were no exception to this manner of confronting demonstrations, and students actually felt physically threatened. Nonetheless, we also were emboldened and pressed forward with these actions. And took them even further. It's sort of strange. If I had done this panel 2 years ago, I would not be able to say this next sentence. But today, it seems that in some ways the political and cultural life that we're living through right now sounds like an echo of life 50 years ago. The same movements are afoot. The same police actions are afoot. The same strife in the country is afoot. Georgetown at this point was not immune to these pressures. The law school faculty was essentially conservative, as were the majority of students. Both were predominantly white and male. I believe at that time in 1967, there was no full-time African-American faculty member. only one full-time woman faculty member, Helen Steinbinder. My 100-student section, there were about 300 of us in the class of 67. Dan had mentioned it had doubled by 1970. But in my section of 100 students, we had only one brown-skinned student, and it was a Hispanic male. There were no African Americans and only about five women. One faculty had the audacity to ask two of those women whether they were just auditing the course. Things like that could, of course, never happen today. On the other hand, there was a very vocal left-wing student group. As you could see from the picture, I might have been a part of that group. And there were a few younger left of center faculty members like Jack Murphy, Dave McCarthy, Jim Oldham, and Addie Bowman, who supported the students and who were instrumental actually in suspending the entire academic program in May of 1970, and also canceled final exams in response to President Nixon's sending troops into Cambodia. Georgetown was also the home of the E. Barrett Prettyman program, a graduate program designed to train criminal defense lawyers and a forerunner of our clinical program. And the Prettyman program became a center for the legal defense of protesters during the marches against the war. We represented people arrested during the insurrection after the Martin Luther King murder. They were also representing left-wingers, more hardcore left-wingers during the May Day demonstrations of 1971. I think 10,000 people were arrested during that demonstration. But we were also providing lawyers and march marshals for virtually every demonstration that came to Washington. In addition, we were the home of the Emergency Bail Fund. I remember running around the city with $10,000 worth of $10 bills in my pockets, bailing people out who'd been arrested in those demonstrations. And we also became a training ground for uptown lawyers who were called upon by the courts to provide legal assistance. They just didn't know how to do an arraignment, and the Prettyman lawyers did. Although Georgetown's model, laws but the means, justice is the end, had been around for a while, it was really put to a test during that period and became a central tenet of what the Law Center is today. Our clinical program is probably the largest public interest firm in America today. It emerged from those public interest activities. We have around 1,000 students that are practicing law in some capacity in the public interest under faculty supervision for credit, and hundreds more involved in public interest projects through the Office of Public Interest and Community Service. So I think I can say in conclusion, thinking about those student years that and where it took us, that the advent of our public service ethos had been quite turbulent and actually was only very slowly recognized by the faculty. But it led to an infusion of that model into our curriculum, into our faculty, into our values, and really into the very heart of the Law Center. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Wally. Ginger.
Good morning, everyone, and a very special hello to those of my former students who are watching. I wish I could see you. I didn't start at Georgetown until 1980, but my introduction to Georgetown and the Georgetown community occurred 11 years earlier in 1969. And what happened then? In 1969, the BALSA chapter of the Black American Law Students Association, which is what it was called then, BALSA, was formed. And my husband, Jerome, was elected its first president. And so I came to know students at Georgetown through BALSA members, some of whom engaged in conversations with me because at that time, I wasn't sure that I wanted to go to law school. I was actually teaching French and Spanish at Eastern Senior High School in the district. But I had a series of conversations in particular with one BALSA student in her first year, and her name was Ruby Costin White. And Ruby had been a teacher. And our conversations were teacher to teacher. And she assured me that I would love law school, as painful as it could be. And she was right. So I did go to law school, obviously, but I didn't go to Georgetown. The next thing that happened is that BALSA in that first year, 1969 to 1970, was pushing for three things. The first was an increase in the number of Black students because the numbers of Black students were very low even then. The second was the increase in Black faculty. There was one Black faculty member. And the third was the hiring of a Black administrator. Finally, in January of 1971, BALSA members and Adrian Fisher, the then dean, convinced Jerry that he should, in fact, join the Georgetown administration in the admissions office, and he worked with Tom Fisher. And then in 1972, he was appointed assistant dean and director of admissions. What that meant was I was able to meet faculty in those social occasions that Dean Fisher held for faculty and senior administrators. So that means that in 1980, when I was hired to become a faculty member, it was like a homecoming. I remember going through my interviews and reconnecting with people like Jim Oldham and Helen Steinbinder and Jack Murphy and Dave Wilmot, whom I had met as a first-year law student in 1970, was the assistant dean and director of admissions. Then those first 7 years were difficult. They were difficult because they were pre-tenure. So as all of those of us who have gone through that process, you hold your breath. And I can say that what got me through those years, in addition to my family and my colleagues, were my students, my contract students, my conflict of law students. There were tough times, but I have so many wonderful memories. They really helped me get through that process. And then outside of the classroom, BALSA. Because I had had that connection through Jerry in the early 70s, when I joined the faculty, I reconnected with BALSA. I attended their programs. BALSA had a cultural arm called Uhuru, and they put on productions, dramatic readings, plays that had actually been authored by law students. I went to those programs and I was very much uplifted by them. And once I achieved tenure, the next, I think, for me, crucial moment in my time at Georgetown that coincides with a special event at the Law Center was when Judy Reed graciously appointed me as Associate Dean for JD and graduate programs. And my first year in that role coincided with the opening of GWords. I can't tell you all of the effort that went into getting ready for the opening of that part of the campus, because it made a significant change in the quality of life, I believe, even for students who weren't living in GWords, because we had a community on campus 24/7, and we had programs for those students that were also open to all of the students on the campus. I have a number of experiences that I could talk about during my time as Associate Dean, and I'll do that primarily through the question and answer period, but I do want to say something, and that's associated with all of my years interacting with BALSA members before I became a part of the Georgetown community, after I became a part of the community. And you see the pictures of the 1981 students, that was during my first year. And that is this: over the years, there have been a number of racial incidents that have been harmful to students, to Black students. And I can say that I believe that the process is in place at the Law Center now to address these issues, especially in light of the most recent unfortunate incident, to address these issues in a systemic and institutional way. I applaud these and encourage these efforts. And I'm going to end it there and turn it back to you, Dan.
Oh, thank you very much, Engineer. That was absolutely terrific. We now go on to Pat King.
I don't see myself on screen.
You watch yourself?
Well,
There you
I
are.
usually do, but I just want, oh, No, I was thinking about
Yeah.
my face as I was talking. In early 1973, I was the deputy director of the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And I received a call from Paul Rothstein, who was then on the faculty of Georgetown Law. He was inquiring about whether I might be interested in teaching at Georgetown. I was interested. I had been an evening student at Georgetown Law School in the 1965-66 academic year. I really liked law school a lot and wanted to give up my job and go full-time, but it wasn't possible. I had many conversations with the dean at that time, Ken Pye, the associate dean, about the possibilities to cover my tuition, but they all went for naught. My point in saying this is that the Georgetown then was a cash-strapped institution and has come very far in the years since then. So I applied to 3 law schools and I was accepted at all 3. And to give you a flavor of what it was like in those days, one of the schools I applied to was the University of Virginia. I was then a resident of Virginia. And the University of Virginia Law School agreed to pay the difference between the cost of going to Virginia and the cost of going to Harvard. In connection with what I just heard from Ginger, I think that we should all remember that actually students like me were being paid to go to law schools elsewhere. Virginia was not the only state that did that. So after Professor Rothstein's call, I had conversations at Georgetown. I got permission from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to take a fully funded leave to try teaching at Georgetown Law School. It was a really tough year, especially for someone who'd never taught before. In that year, I taught 3 unrelated courses: closed corporations, constitutional law, and advanced civil procedure. We would never do that to anyone today. I survived with generous guidance and help from a few members who were of the faculty, who appreciated the dilemma that I was in. And I was offered a full-time position and joined Georgetown Law in 1974. When I arrived at Georgetown, it was clear that Georgetown had started to recruit women and minority faculty and students. These were the very early days. There were 2 African-American faculty members when I arrived: Jerome Schulman, who was at the time on leave, and Anita Martin, who later left shortly thereafter. In addition to me, there were 2 other women: Anita Martin, whom I've mentioned, myself, and Judith Reed and Monica Gallagher, who subsequently also left, and Helen Steinbinder, who was the first tenured woman at Georgetown Law School. I happened to be the first tenured Black faculty member at Georgetown. In 1974, just as I was joining the faculty, I was asked to be a member of the first National Bioethics Commission, and it's called the National Commission, that Congress had just established. One of the events that led to the creation of that commission was the unveiling of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. My service on the National Commission caused me to reevaluate what I would like to be involved in as an academic at Georgetown Law. So I gradually managed to teach in areas like torts, family law, and to create a seminar in bioethics. My scholarship was focused on these emerging issues in science and in medicine. And my interest always remained, beginning with Tuskegee and the impact of this changing area of science and medicine on African Americans and other minorities. The other members of the faculty, a few other members of the faculty, Judith Reed, Alex Capron, who is now at USC, and Steve Goldberg, authored the first legal textbook that dealt with law, science, and medicine. And that continued in several revisions over many years, later joined by Professor Larry Gostin. And over the years, as I look back, more faculty members were interested in these areas. And we have current faculty that have carried on this tradition. My ability to join Georgetown Law and my ability to sort of get into a new area of law for that time says a great deal about Georgetown Law in the last 50 years, because we have continued as a law school to develop and lead in various areas of law in their infancy. And when I think today that Larry Gostin runs the Global Law Institute, I think that suggests what I enjoy about Georgetown, its capacity to evolve, and not evolve slowly, to evolve quickly in areas that we can introduce to our students. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, so often when you think of size, you have the metaphor of a battleship, and that Georgetown is very large and it's hard to move it. But in fact, I think your point is spot on, that because we have resources and some flexibility, we can be wieldy and responsive to new developments in the law in a way that might be harder for a smaller school. I hadn't reflected on that until you said that.
Yeah.
Jim Feinerman.
Well, thanks, Dan, and thanks to my colleagues who have preceded me. I'm the newcomer, I guess, among this group, except for Dan and Bill, who came to Georgetown after I did. And it's hard for me to imagine that I've now been at Georgetown for 3.5 decades, give or take a few years when I was on leave of absence. And when I arrived at Georgetown in 1985-86, I was coming from 2 years of teaching and administering at my law school alma mater, Harvard, which was described at the time in an article in the New Yorker as Beirut on the Charles. It was a very unhappy faculty that was riven by divisions, political and otherwise. And I was looking to see if there was a possibility of getting a full-time teaching job somewhere else that was maybe a happier place, and also a place where my longtime fiance, and now wife, and I could finally have our careers together. Barbara's a tax lawyer, and DC was an ideal location for the practice that she was in. And as lucky as I was, after a year look-see visit, Georgetown decided to take me on permanently, and I've been here ever since. I feel like my career could be described with the title of a movie and a book. The movie was the 1940s, The Man Who Came to Dinner. I came for a year and stayed for 35. And Lucky Jim, and unlike the Jim of Kingsley Amos's book, I actually have been quite lucky at Georgetown in a number of ways. Most importantly, it was something that Georgetown really wanted to build on and expand, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But when I came, I was asked to teach, among other things, a class in comparative law, which had up to that time been taught primarily by adjunct faculty, including the longest serving adjunct in the history of Georgetown law, John Wolfe, who was already teaching and had been teaching for many years by the time that I came. But the idea that I would also bring an expertise in Chinese law, which is the field that I had decided to focus on for my research and scholarship, and also the experience of having been a Wall Street associate for several years. I had the unique portfolio that first year of teaching comparative law, Chinese law, and corporate finance, all of which subjects I've continued to teach over the years, although actually moving more into the corporate area in recent years when I was also taking on responsibilities as an associate dean. And I was recruited by a triumvirate that included Edie Weiss, Edith Brown Weiss, who was already teaching international law here at Georgetown, and Barry Carter and Chuck Gustafson, who were trying to make Georgetown more internationalist, but also more comparative. And in fact, it was something of a battle for those first couple of years that I was here. People would say, "You're the international guy," and I would say, "No, I'm actually the comparative guy. It's a different field." The difference is that what I'm focusing on is the law of different legal systems in different countries, rather than the international rules that govern the international polity. And that was something that was, a little hard to grasp until I was joined by many other colleagues. And I would say that over the past 35 years, what's been amazing to me is how the faculty in international and comparative law has grown and strengthened with many new colleagues. Now there are over 24 full-time faculty and many more adjunct colleagues who teach. And I'm confident that there's no law faculty in the United States and perhaps anywhere in the world that has as much depth and expertise as Georgetown does. In the clinical area, we have clinics run by Phil Schrag, Sue Ross, and Bob Stumberg that have, in our excellent clinical top-rated program, brought an international dimension to clinical legal education. Edie Weiss and Don Wallace have remained distinguished members of the international law faculty, although Don is now in retirement. He still teaches occasionally for us, and Edie is still going strong at the top of our international law faculty. We brought on some years ago, now over a decade ago, Chris Brummer, who succeeded John Jackson in running and expanding the International Institute of Economic Law. I've been impressed by the number of people that we've brought in as both adjuncts and part-time faculty, people like Joost Paulin and Jennifer Hillman, who work in the WTO and international trade field. In comparative law, the field that I've been teaching in, at least 4 new people have joined the full-time faculty since I came. Lamu Abaoda, who teaches in the area of Egyptian and Arabic law. Alvaro Santos, who teaches in the field of Latin American comparative law. Philo Sukala and Franz Rero, who both teach European comparative law. We've also expanded the genuine internationalists with very distinguished people like Carlos Vasquez, Jane Stromseth, and David Stewart, who was for many years an adjunct member of our faculty and now is a full-time member. People like Andy Schenholz, who runs the Human Rights Clinic, Anne-Marie Weitzel, who came to us as an expert in international comparative law and also works to train our students in areas of negotiation and international comparative practice. And most recently, we've tenured 2 younger colleagues, Lily Faulhaber and Yvonne Chu, who also work in the fields of comparative and international law. And other people who aren't primarily internationalists have taken on international work. Before they left our faculty, both Mark Tushnet and Vicki Jackson began dabbling and eventually became quite expert in comparative constitutional law, a field that they've authored 2 editions of a textbook on and still teach, although now elsewhere. David Luban and Julia Sullivan have taken on international criminal law and related topics. Naomi Mezzi has worked in a comparative vein in the work that she does in cultural studies. Rosa Brooks and David Koplow, who teach in many other fields, are also firmly rooted in the international field. And Larry Gostin, who's already been mentioned by several of my colleagues, has created in the O'Neill program, the premier program in international and global health law, and combined it with clinical and other experiences for our students and faculty colleagues. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the oldest member of our faculty, Father Les Orsi, who's been teaching both ancient and canon law at Georgetown for many years after his long and distinguished career, including having been the dean at a sister law school here in Washington, D.C. So we have, along with the recently established Center for Transnational Legal Studies in London, which was pioneered in a joint effort by Barry Carter and by our former dean, Alex Alanikoff. We have, I think, a program in the international dimensions and comparative law that's second to none, and quite a jewel in the crown here at Georgetown.
Thank you, Jim. One of the attendees was particularly interested in Georgetown's relationship over the years with China. And I know that's been such a central concern of yours. What has it meant to you that, what have we been doing generally in our engagement with China, and what has it meant to you?
Well, I'd say we've done 3 things, and I hope all of them well. One is, even before I came, we had adjunct faculty, Bill Alford, who went on to a long distinguished career, first at UCLA and then Harvard, teaching a course in Chinese law, succeeded by Natalie Lichtenstein, who turned down the offer to join our full-time faculty because she was offered a position as a new counsel at the World Bank, just as China was becoming a member. So we've been teaching, I think, as long as almost any school in the country, with the possible exception of Harvard, courses in Chinese law, and expanding them beyond the sort of basic course in Chinese law. Lucille Barali, who is a decades-long partner at Freshfields and a predecessor firm, has been teaching the foreign investment law of China for us. We've had Paul Salsky, who works at the SEC, teaching Chinese commercial and securities law for us. And we've had occasional visitors from China who have both taught and lectured about Chinese law subjects. More importantly, and perhaps more significantly for the law school, we've had an influx of Chinese students that could barely be imagined at the time that I came. I think when I arrived in 1985, there had only been 2 or 3 students from the People's Republic of China, which had just recently opened up and normalized relations with the United States in 1979. So it was understandable. But even for many years afterwards, we would have 1 or 2 Chinese students a year from mainland China. We, of course, had students from Taiwan and Hong Kong. But beginning about 10 or 12 years ago, we started getting large numbers of students from China coming for our graduate program. This is the 1-year program that students are in LLM in. And even more recently than that, a number of students, Chinese students who had studied undergraduates in the United States, who then came for our 3-year JD program. So in any given year, we have well over 100 students from mainland China at Georgetown, which again, I think is probably the largest group of Chinese students in any US law school. And then finally, we've been working in various ways to partner with Chinese law schools and do cooperative programs that allow our faculty. Our dean, Bill Traynor, will be speaking on one of these programs in connection with the Peking University Law School later on this semester. But we've visited a number of times. We've gone to participate in conferences in China. And of course, we've had Chinese visitors come here for both conferences and for stints as visiting scholars. So it's a huge engagement, probably one of the largest efforts at the university as a whole to engage with China at the law school.
Thanks, Jim. As you can imagine, I've been, if I've been putting up pictures of all my colleagues' younger selves, I felt an obligation to do that for myself. And actually something that Ginger said in her talk when she referred to herself as being the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, reminded me that among her duties was to help a very young Dan Ernst in his first year of teaching negotiate some of the problems of doing that. And as I think back at how she did that, it reminded me about how many of the people who've taken leadership roles at the Law Center do things out of sense of professionalism, sense of duty, but also just out of kindness, that the people who've had our decanal positions, who become leaders of the institution, have also been great people who are focusing in on seeing each other as whole people. And, you know, toxic workplaces are so much in the news these days. It is striking to me that we've had a series of deans who have maintained that kind of atmosphere. And if I think back about, for me, since I came in '88, what's made that difference? It's that we're a bunch of colleagues who see each other, and we've had leaders who fostered that. I want to jump back to something that Jim Olden mentioned, and that maybe Wally could elaborate on, which is the counter-dedication in 1971, where there's Warren Burger inside the law school and William Kunstler outside the law school, with throngs of law students around him. And I wonder, Wally, could you tell us what's going on here, or what it was like?
So I actually was one of the planners of that event. I had already graduated from the law school, but I was hanging around. Actually had an office in the law school at that time, working on another project. But what happened was, when the students went to Butch Fisher and said, we want to have Kunstler on the panel to dedicate the law school, Butch originally said yes, he would invite Kunstler. When Warren Burger heard that, his response was, then I'm not coming. And so between those two events, Fisher had actually invited Kunstler. So he had to uninvite Kunstler at that point, which caused an uproar amongst these students. And so we went out to First and E, we got a permit. We not only invited Kunstler, we invited Katie Rohrbeck, a very, very famous woman labor lawyer, Arthur Kenoy, who was president of the National Lawyers Guild at that point, and a young Turk Washington rebel named Marion Barry, who was running a group called Pride Incorporated at the time. And I'll never forget, you know, Marion is a very complex guy, and I actually worked on 2 of his transition teams. But I remember that at that session, Marion had the best statement. He said to the students, I want you to look at that building. What's going on in that building is totally irrelevant. And if you don't do something good with your life, you're going to be totally irrelevant as well. I'll never forget that. It was an amazing moment, brought down the house. And so that's what was going on. It's totally peaceful, although there were a lot of police officers around it. But it was just part of the ethos of that moment. I don't know, Jim was my assistant dean at the time. He could probably tell you more about what was going on in Butch's mind as he tried to sort his way out of this. But, you know, Butch, most of our deans, as you said, and I think Ginger and said as well, all of our deans, and I had the pleasure of being associate dean for 3 of them, which is pretty remarkable. They were all really quite wonderful, and tried to accommodate as best they can, not only what the faculty wanted, but what the students wanted as well. I think that's been a hallmark of our institution. We had deans that try to make it work rather than deans that try and get in your way. And one of them I just want to mention, because I would be remiss if I didn't, Judy Reed basically made my entire career. She was to my mind, one of our great deans, hired me to run the clinic, hired me to be an associate dean for clinics, and basically handed me the key to the vault to build the clinical program into what it is today. So Judy, if you're out there, thank you.
Yep, and there she is with Wally and Chuck Ruff. We are about at the end of the hour. Those attendees who want to leave, and some of my colleagues who might have to may, should feel free at this point. But we're going to stay on for just a few more questions. So if you do feel you have to leave, thank you very much for your attendance. And then I think we'll just stay on for just a few more questions. Well, I wonder if each of you would just take a moment, if you're still with us, and think about, as you look back, what event or development seems like a turning point in the history of the Law Center while you were here. Either the Law Center as a whole or some part of it that you cared about while you were on the faculty. So if you sort of look back and say, oh, that was the turning point, that was significant. What do you have in mind?
Who should speak?
What, me? Oh, you go ahead, Jim, you start.
Well, it's a great question. And one of the early experiences that we haven't had occasion to describe was the major financial crisis in about 1972. The president of the university at the time was very beneficial to the university in one sense. He sort of brought the computers into the administration so that we began to have material and records in electronic form. And this was a great step forward. But one of the byproducts, which the president had not, I think, anticipated, was that the law faculty could then find out about financial data that had been going on in the university and discovered that, as you can see in the cartoons that's just been put on the screen, the university had been siphoning off about $1 million a year from the law school. And this led to a huge uproar, even to the point that at one stage we had a representative of the Teamsters Union patrolling the halls trying to get faculty to sign authorization cards so that they could represent the faculty. That didn't happen, but it was startling that it did, that even that took place. And it led to this showdown between the law faculty and the president. And we won't go through the details of that, but the outcome was, I've described it to others as we lost the battle but won the war, because we never recouped the $1 million per year that had been taken from us. But we got a commitment that is in place still today to install 3 campus budgeting, so that the university campus would be one, the medical facilities would be the other, and the law school would be the third. And this gave us financial independence. And that has, I think, been extremely beneficial to us over the years. Dan, if I may just mention one other thing that I don't think we can go into details about, but one of the beauties of this law school is its multicultural presence and its openness to surprising things. And the surprising thing that I would mention is the Gilbert and Sullivan Society, which was founded in about 1972 And we performed nearly all of Gilbert and Sullivan's operettas. The starting one, of course, was Trial by Jury. And I was pleased to be in a number of those. Indeed, in HMS Pinafore, I was a sailor in that show, and my son, Nelson, who was 6 years old at the time, instead of being a midshipman, he was on stage as the midshipmite. Anyway, that was a lovely part of the early years.
Absolutely. Imagine coming to a law school and seeing your colleagues performing. I think Pete Wales's Pippin was quite memorable for me. And I'm just, this is not the University of Chicago at all. This is a very different place. Pat, do you want to say something about Turning Point?
I can think of, well, I'll think of two. One was gradual and one is more best thought of as a turning point. The law school not only got 3 campus budgeting that Jim has already described, but I would say that the second major event that solidified the existence of the law school within the university and helped give us a bit more control over what we did was the disruption when the then president of the university did not want to give the same Judy Reed that's already been mentioned a 3rd term. And what was exciting about that, and he wasn't going to do it, is that the whole law school, it had nothing to do except with solidarity. The whole law school thought that this was too much of an overreach by the main campus. And the then president of the university backed off, and Professor Reed served a 3rd term as dean. So having somewhat independent, some additional independence from the main campus was really important. And please understand that in many law schools, this existed before we got it. Helped us, and I refer back to earlier remarks, enabled us to be ahead of many other law schools. And I think about Wally's clinical program in particular that he's already discussed. Other schools came slowly to having clinical programs. I can also think about the fact that when I came, as I expressed, women were unheard of in law. And over the years, and not to mention African Americans, and over the years, the Georgetown faculty and the Georgetown student body have become really diverse. And if you don't believe it, you should go to a few other law schools and see. And I think that the willingness to experiment, the willingness to take risks, the idea that law schools did not have to be as traditional as the one I attended, I think have made Georgetown. That it was always tension. Do we look like everybody else, or do we go on our own? And in many instances, we struck out on our own. And I think that that was particularly important in terms of our success as a major law school.
And I think I would add to that, that when I was thinking about turning points for me, it was the merging of the clinical and the tenure track. That's viewing, the faculty life as the place to look for turning point. But it is, I think, kept the more creative tension or more things from being settled than if we had just a narrowly focused idea of what scholarship or contributions to the life of the law school was. That's made a big difference over the years, and that is striking out in a direction that other law schools haven't tried to go. Ginger.
Yes, I would say that the opening of the library was another one of those turning points. It made a huge difference in the quality of life at the law school. I remember before 1989, when the library opened during exam periods, going down to what was then called the B1 level or the first floor, and you saw groups of students sitting on the floor studying. There just was not enough space in the law school for people for students to study together. And the opening of that beautiful building also meant, and you can correct me on this, Wally, but I believe all of the clinics that were outside of the law school, housed in different parts of the District of Columbia, were able to come in the building because we were able to free up space for them. So I think that was a significant turning point with respect to the quality of life for students, and also with respect to the quality of life when it came to our full community being able to be in the building.
Anyone else on turning points?
I'll just expand on what Ginger just said. You know, at all universities, as ours too, there's often a debate between whether you're going to do scholarly programs or bricks and mortar. And I've always said to myself, and I think many would agree, that the buildings that we have built have made a huge difference in the draw of our law school from to the applicants in our diversity of programs. And so we're really a little college campus now, all to ourselves. And I think that it's perhaps unique in this country.
Yeah, and when I try and think about how, Jim, as you sometimes say, that students were very dissatisfied with being in the law school in the 1970s, and there was even the slogan, nope, you tell me, not one penny ever. If I'm trying to think about changes that have happened over that period of time, the attention that's been devoted to the student experience seems to me to be very dramatic, and bricks and mortar and buildings are obviously a key part of that. But I do think we had deans, and I'm thinking mostly about Judy Reed, who focused in on the staff that were student facing and thinking about that student facing experience in the registrar's office and in the placement, and really attending to managing that, which not all law deans want to do. So it may not have been experienced by any one student at any one period of time, but over time, over the years, I think that has been where we've devoted an enormous amount of resources, both physical in the buildings, but also managerial. Jim Feinerman, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I don't want to keep the focus on bricks and mortar, but I think it's significant in the development and expansion of the law school in the international and comparative realm that we dedicated a building in 2004 to that. Eric Hotung gave us a magnificent gift that allowed the expansion of the campus. It was coupled, of course, with the Scott Ginsburg physical fitness and sports facility as well. But very few law schools have devoted that kind of space specifically to international and comparative law. And it's I think one of the hallmarks of Georgetown that it not only does this in its academic work and with the faculty, but also in the physical space that's devoted to the promotion of those programs.
I would just add that everything that we've just talked about right now goes back to the day when Butch Fisher secured 3 campus budgeting for us, because we could hire the faculty we wanted to hire without having to compete with a slot in the chemistry department. We could preserve reserves of our own so we could build the campus out that we wanted to. We could experiment and evolve in ways that other schools could not do because they were constrained by a provost that we didn't have to bother with. So it's hard to underestimate or even overestimate, I'm not sure which way you would look at that, but just how critical getting that kind of independence within the whole. I remember at one point, a member of the board told me, Wally, don't get too cocky. There's really only one checkbook at the university. But within that one checkbook, we had a lot of flexibility to sign those checks. And we were able to do things for the students, things for the faculty, things for the campus that other law schools just could not do on their own. So I think that's critical. And looking forward, preserving that as much as that independence as one can in order to steer this ship on our own within the collegiality of a university system.
Can I just add one other thing? You heard Wally refer to Dean Fisher as Butch. That was his nickname. But he was a wonderfully kind man, not very well organized as we all could remember. But I mentioned that because I wanted to say that if you look from the entire span of years, the 50 years we're dealing with, our deans have been really splendid leaders, and we can identify that their characteristics as beneficial, and there's a good deal of variety in their characteristics and backgrounds and personalities. But I think all of them have served us extremely well.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel obliged to put this picture up, even though it's not our best image, because it gives you an idea of a different dean and his relationship, though, with students. So here is Dave McCarthy. And I think you can get from that picture that he is just engaging the students as someone who's welcoming people into the legal profession, trying to talk through with a lawyer. And they're women, but he's also just dealing with them as people who want to be lawyers. And I've always thought that was very attractive to me. He was teaching property when I started, and just to get a sense from him that the thing that he brought to the classroom was trying to model a lawyerly sensibility, but also professionalism. And that infused what he taught. That it helped me understand that I'm not just teaching black letter law, I'm teaching something else. And I think that's part of what I got from Dave. I think we have time for one question. We've been talking about the view from the faculty because that's where we are. But we have a lot of alumni with us. And I wonder if anyone has any recollections of moments teaching that kind of stick with them when they think back about themselves, yourselves in the classroom. If there's anything you would want to share, and please just jump in.
All right, I'll share one. The first student in the juvenile justice clinic was a woman named Mary Lupo. And one of the significant events, both in my life and the university's life, is that Mary and her husband, Ed Ricci, provided the chair for the first chair in clinical education at the law school. And also one of a handful of chairs at that time for a clinical teacher. I will never forget Mary. I see her as often as I can. I'm hoping she's in this audience as well, but that was a signal event on a lot of different issues. Let me just say one thing back on a signal event because it's part of this as well. One of Bob Petoskey's negotiating points when he was becoming a dean with the then president was to get his own development officer. We did not have our own development officer until that time. So when you combine that with the original 3 campus budgeting and then the ability to go out and raise your money yourself was significant. But I remember Mary Lupo as one of my best choices ever in my relationships with students.
Anyone else?
Can I just tell, this is a bit whimsical and I apologize for that, but it's one of my classroom moments that is a favorite. I was teaching contracts in Hall 5, and my syllabus topic then was the mental capacity necessary to be bound by a contract. And my twin brother is a psychiatrist, and his specialty is personality disorders. And he happened to be in town that day. And I said to John, look, you know this area because you're an expert here. Why don't you take my casebook and go into class and start teaching my contracts class? So he agreed to do that. And I'm peeking into the little windows that you can see through to look into Hall 5. And John goes in and goes to the podium, opens the book, and begins speaking about the subject matter that he's quite an expert on. And I'm watching the students, and they're quite puzzled here. They're looking at each other, not knowing what to do. And the reason that was not because we didn't look alike or we didn't speak alike, but because he had a mustache. They just couldn't compute. And as I've said to others, it was a wonderful illustration of the suspension of disbelief. At any rate, it's a favorite memory.
Anyone else?
I
Ginger?
have a memory. It occurred during a storm, one of our February storms in DC that sometimes shuts down, really shuts down, not the 1.5 inches where we close the federal government, but this was a real storm. And I had gone and I was teaching conflicts of laws from 11:10 to 12:35. So I got into school and I go into the classroom, and I think I had maybe about 60, 65 students in the class, and there were about 6 people there. And I'm teaching away and I'm gesticulating and I'm walking back and forth as I was wont to do. And out of the corner of my eye, I see someone waving at the door. And I went over and it was someone from the registrar's office, and he said, "Professor Patterson, you're the only one teaching in the building." So, so I stopped the class and I told people that classes had been canceled, but they had been canceled late. And what I remember is there was one student who came up to me afterwards, and he looked bedraggled, and he said, "I just want you to know that it took me so long to get into this school that if I had gotten here and class had been canceled, I really would have been upset." So I said, "Oh, I'm glad. Made a good call that time." But that's one of my funny and favorite experiences.
Jim, do you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I had the experience, and this is sort of telling a tale on myself. I was teaching an evening section of first-year contracts, and it met on Tuesday and Friday nights. And needless to say, Friday night from 5:45 to 7:45, we hated each other by the end of the semester. It was just, I was keeping them from their weekend, they were keeping me from mine. And one day, this was in the late 80s, someone's pager went off. And he started clomping down the stairs to get out of the classroom to the door. And I, decided to chide him by saying, "Deal going down," and everyone laughed. Before the next class, the following Tuesday, he came back to me and said, "I'm sorry about what happened in class on Friday, but I'm an emergency room physician and I moonlight by and I had somebody in an emergency situation I had to take care of. And I felt like 2 cents that, I was basically, annoyed by the fact that there was this disruption of class, but it was for a very good reason. So I felt like I had to publicly apologize to him in front of the whole class when we finally got together that Tuesday.
Yeah, and it's an example that may have been viewed as unprofessional as you experienced it, but was the ultimate act of professionalism. He was trying to respond to a call for his responsibilities.
But it also speaks to the incredible, variety of students that we have and the things that they do and have done before they've come to law school, while they're in law school, and after they graduate. They're multidimensional.
For me, the moments are when students in real time realized that something that they could do something that they thought was really hard, that it was something that was very difficult. And then in the middle of class, say in a large first section class, the students do it. There was one year, it was in a hall where, if you are calling in the front of the row and you're at the lectern, the student is just talking to you. So if you can, you go to the back of the hall and lecture and conduct the exchange from the back, so the whole class came in. And it was some issue in servitude law, running covenants, where the question required the student who was deeply enmeshed in one case to remember a kind of obscure rule that I taught 2 days before. And it was like, well, what happened if they sued for damages rather for an injunction to enforce this covenant? And the students stopped for a minute and then got the answer. And the whole class spontaneously applauded the guy. It was not a class that spontaneously applauded, but it was just kind of an affirmation. And it happened to be a day when my daughter, who was quite relational, was in the classroom, and she was impressed by my performance and everything, but she was really impressed by the dynamic. The other time I can remember, again, it was servitude law, and you either had the logic of the law and you had it or you didn't. I was going down an aisle and I called on a student who was from a very small place in the South. And I asked the question, and you could tell with this body of law whether you had it or you didn't. And she had it. I asked her the question again, she still had it. I went on to the next student, he didn't have it. Went back to that student, she still had it. And that was that, friends. Everyone in that room could see it. And it was an affirmation of students doing the work and getting recognized. Well, I shouldn't end on me, but I think we've been here quite a bit. I don't want to cut anyone else off. All right. Thank you all, colleagues, for sharing. And thank you all, attendees, for sharing your time with us, too.
And I would just like, on behalf of the panel and the people who planned this, to thank Dan for the extraordinary work that he put into it, and Carol Prieto as well, because this has really been fun for us and also a lot of hard work. So thank you, Dan.
Okay.
And also William, who is
Yes, and William.
off camera, but has been very, very helpful.